disparaging the professional core element of the Russian army. But if you now go for a further mobilization, which of course from a military point of view makes every sense in the world if you want to win this, you begin to find that you are tackling all sorts of middle-class people, all sorts of people who don't support the war. The Russians, I think, take a figure, have lost at least 500 to 700,000 youngsters who've just left the country, men and women, of course. So a mobilization would make sense in a total war, but you've got to convince the society that it's worth that sacrifice. And at a certain stage, enough people are going to say, I don't think the collapse of the Russian economy and the conscription of all these young men and women is worth it for Ukraine.
Russia is reportedly creating something of a new formation that has been identified as the 18th Combined Arms Army. The UK's Ministry of Defence suggests this could be to free up airborne forces to plug holes around Kyiv. Do you think this suggests that Russia fears a breakthrough here? As you know, Ukraine has been focusing on it in recent weeks.
Yes, I'm sure it's what we would call a sort of a sensible tactical or operational level readjustment of forces. They're defending a line, or both sides are fighting along a line nearly 1,000 kilometers long. And as you quite rightly said, Louis, the Ukrainian intention would be to break through basically to the Sea of Azov, or the Black Sea, to cut off Crimea. It threatens the Kerch bridges, etc., and would then be dominating the peninsula. The Russians have always got to be aware that wherever the Ukrainians attack, they need to have enough forces in reserve, or enough forces at that point to stop that or stop it developing. They are obviously using drones, they're using all their intelligence. And at the moment, the Ukrainians haven't been able to mass enough troops to break through. But the Russians are very good at holding defensive lines and then using reserves to basically deal with any potential breakthrough. They're doctrinally very good at it. They'd be very inept at using combined arms in offence, but I suspect they'd be quite considerably better in defence.
And you mentioned they're quite good at combined arms. We've heard quite a bit about these attack helicopters that Russia have been using in a defensive way. What sort of role have they played on the battlefield?
Well, they're hugely important, and of course, it's exactly why the Ukrainians have been pushing for the F-16s, an air component. It just so happens the F-16s are probably the best solution to that request. But the domination of the third dimension is really, really important for attacking in depth, for reconnaissance, for surveillance, for breaking up concentrations of armor, spoiling maneuver capability. The Russians are very good, again, at using attack helicopters in conjunction with their infantry and armor. The Ukrainians don't actually have that luxury at the moment. As I said, though, the Russians are better at defense, or were proving to be better at defense, or more adept than they were in assault, where they seem to hardly moved on since the Second World War in terms of just throwing massed artillery and massed infantry at quite well-prepared positions.
And you mentioned these F-16s. We've, of course, now got the confirmation that Denmark and the Netherlands are going to be sending a group of F-16s out to Ukraine. But it seems unlikely at this point that they will have much of an impact on this counteroffensive, do we think?
I think that's absolutely right, Louis. If you were going to have NATO pilots and ground staff operating F-16, you could bring them into the fight immediately. That's why we have air forces. The problem for the Ukrainians is, although they obviously have an air force and they have pilots and they have ground staff, actually handing over a capability and building it up to turn MiG fighter pilots into F-16 fighter pilots inevitably takes a while. I'm not going to say, it's not quite like stepping across from a Ford Fiesta into a Ferrari, where you can broadly grab it, but it's all the weapon systems, and it's very much the ground crew, and so it will take time. It is important. It's a very important gesture of solidarity, I think. It's something the Ukrainians badly need. It's a pity in some ways we didn't make the decision earlier, but it has been politically quite fraught because the Americans and a number of other NATO allies are very worried about broadening this conflict outside the borders of Ukraine. Very frustrating for the Ukrainians, but I think understandable politically.
And we understand there's already been some training of these pilots going on, possibly on simulators. Is there anything else that the West could provide, training-wise, or to Ukraine directly, that could speed up this process?
It is quite difficult. As I say, if you are a fast jet pilot, you can get into another fast jet. As I say, the Ford Fiesta, Ferrari, whatever. But you will need a certain amount of familiarization, particularly to fly it in combat. It's one thing to fly an aircraft. It's another thing to fly it in combat. It's another thing to fly it in combat against another air force as well. And clearly, the ground staff need training up. So I think it can be done quite quickly. Simulation is absolutely the way ahead. I think there is a familiarity. I wouldn't surprise me if a certain amount of under-the-counter training has been done, or under-the-counter familiarization has been done. But physically moving a capability from Denmark or Holland into Ukraine, where it's going to be vulnerable, of course, to Russian air attack or missile attack, and building up a force that will put a pilot in an aircraft on a combat mission will take time. It's not insuperable at all. It's done quite routinely, but there is a level of sophistication in air operations that really is, of a quality different than, say, tank or infantry or engineer artillery operations.
Although they don't have them yet, nevertheless, with F-16s and Leopard tanks, Ukraine's military significantly changed in the space of almost a year. Do you think this is going to give them the protection that they need to deter a possible future Russian incursion that many have been fearing?
I mean, it's worth saying, Louis, that we've been training the Ukrainian army really since, I suppose, 2014, after the Russians took the Crimea. So an important part of that training and sort of reformation of the Ukrainian army has undoubtedly been its equipment, but it has been its training and its doctrine and the mindset of its commanders. And undoubtedly, they, of course, have added now to that a lot of experience on the battlefield. So we've tried to change them from a Soviet-minded army or armed forces into a Western-minded armed forces. The reality, of course, is that there are gaps, and one of them has been armor, which we are trying to mitigate with the Challenger 2s and the Leopards, etc. One of them certainly we referred to as the air component. That's coming up. One of them is of course, the older generation of Ukrainians still were trained on the Russian doctrine, and the younger ones, to an extent, are having to learn on the job. But training of the Ukrainians has gone back some distance, and we've certainly seen the effect on the battlefield, where the Ukrainians have appeared to be a lot more agile, a lot more imaginative in their tactics than the Russian counterparts.
And you mentioned some of the more up-to-date tactics that the Ukrainians used. We've had reports again this morning of flights diverted in Moscow after a drone was shot down near around the city. Some have criticized the idea of Ukraine, as Zelensky's put it, sort of taking the war to Russia. What do you think the role of these drone attacks within Russia's borders is in this war?
Well, we've had quite a lot of debate about who's responsible for the drone attacks. Some we think might have been a false flag operation by Putin himself, just to rally support among Russians and sort of highlight the threat. Some might be from Russian dissidents. Some of these attacks have been well reported in the press, but of actually no military significance at all. And some the Ukrainians have been quite coy about. The Ukrainians have made it very clear publicly that they will not use any equipment donated to them by allies outside the borders of Ukraine, whatever the temptation, but they understand the sensitivities when it comes to national parliaments continuing to support Ukraine. They have, however, said, quite rightly, under Article 51, I think, of the United Nations, that they have a right of self-defense, and therefore, if there's anything that they produce internally within Ukraine, and they include drones, that they reserve the right to use them. Now, in many ways, they don't alter the price of fish on the battlefield, but they have an interesting psychological effect in terms of saying to the Russians and the Russian people, we can strike you. It's not all one way, and it also to an extent, I suppose, tackles the, it damages the reputation of the Russian armed forces that they can't defend even their capital, and it damages the reputation of Putin. So it serves a number of objectives, very few of them to do with the fighting on the ground in Ukraine.
We have also seen drones play an important role in the Black Sea, where Ukraine is mounting something of a fight back against Russia's grain blockade. Do you think these sort of seaborne remote drones will continue to have an impact on Russia's capability there?
I do. I think, on one hand, it's the straight physical threat. We saw the attack on, I couldn't even pronounce, Novosibirsk. We saw the attack on the Moskva early on. We saw the attack on that the oil tanker. On the one hand, it's very good deterrence. On the one hand, it really does rattle the Russian Navy. On the other hand, of course, it does deter people from sending their own ships into the Black Sea to bring the grain or oil out if they can. And that's a sort of big strategic issue. It's another demonstration of intent. It's another demonstration of Ukrainian resilience. I would say on the wider side is the one surprise, or I suppose new aspect of this war compared to other conflicts I've seen or been in, is this proliferation of drones in every dimension. Suicide drones, seaborne drones, deep strike zones, surveillance drones, target acquisition drones, mini drones, maxi drones. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when I think back to my early time in the military, when they were really very, very exquisite technology, highly expensive technology, held at the highest possible level. So the expansion of drones, robotics, artificial intelligence does point, I fear, the way ahead for future conflicts.
And how important are some of those logistical targets that have been hit in and around the Black Sea, both on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, things like the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, but also these grain ports that the Russians have continued to hit very hard?
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, they serve a strategic objective. They send a very big message. On the other hand, strategically, they do damage the idea that we can get grain out, which of course is, Ukraine and Russia are the two great grain baskets really of the world. At the operational level, of course, the Ukrainians are doing a lot to make the Russian hold on Crimea as tenuous as possible. If you link that to the potential objectives of the counteroffensive to break the link between, as it were, mainland Russia and support for the Russians in Crimea, they are really important. So across the piece, there is in any war levels of operations, some of which technically should be linking up from the tactical through the operational to the strategic. Some of them messaging, some of them directly related to the battlefield, some of them are much wider implications. And I'd put certainly the attacks on grain and oil in the latter category.
We've also, as you mentioned before, seen foreign flagged vessels boarded by Russian naval troops. We saw that shocking footage of Russian troops being dropped in by helicopter. How significant an escalation is that when Russia is prepared to drop onto other nations' vessels?
Well, this again goes back to the whole issue of winning the narrative, the strategic narrative. It's a bit like we said, Ukraine doesn't want to alienate its Western backers by attacking or using NATO weaponry outside its borders. The Russians have to be very careful, at the moment, because they are under huge economic pressure, as you know. The balance of power between Moscow and Beijing is really changing. Moscow, even in New Delhi, changing Moscow and the West. So doing these things that might be tactically useful onto a neutral shipping or global shipping is a two-edged weapon. It might give you a small tactical advantage. It might send an interesting message about your military capability, but it might also have a strategic issue for you, either diplomatically or the capacity for other people to want to risk their shipping anywhere near Russian waters. So again, people have to be quite careful about tactical activity that has strategic effect at a time when politics and economics are as important as action on the battlefield.
Um, Speaking of things off the battlefield, Russian security services have reportedly told Vladimir Putin to get rid of his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. There's still a lot of tension at the moment between Russian leadership. What sort of effect do you think that can have?
I think it's very unsettling if you're a commander. I don't know whether the soldiers on the ground will be as affected. They're probably more affected by the intensity of the fighting. But the command element, I think, will always have an eye back up the chain of command. And they want to have confidence in their leadership. They've seen, of course, the Prigozhin Wagner Group mutiny. You can't disguise now, you can't be separated from the battlefield the way you were in the Second World War from the politics. Everybody can access things. So they will be reading on certain feeds about dissension in the Kremlin, dissension between Putin and his top leadership. I mean, Shoigu, I don't think is any military experience at all anyway. So one of the demands of Prigozhin was get rid of these clowns at the top who are there for all the wrong reasons because they're not proper professionals. Not that Prigozhin was, frankly, he had a catering contract in St. Petersburg. But these sort of things unsettle. And the two things we've always hoped we might find, although neither of them will come without consequences, is one, there was a sort of palace coup in Moscow. Now, the dangers are you get somebody even more ultra-nationalist than Putin, as it were. The second one, of course, is you get a collapse of morale and fighting spirit among the soldiers in the front line. And we've always been trying to keep a look out for this, that the Ukrainians can use this strategic narrative, the uncertainty that comes from the Prigozhin mutiny and, these calls for the senior leadership of the Russian military to be sacked, plus the fact that they've had hard pounding, taken high casualties, clearly failed, that there might be a case where the Russian army refuses to fight or the conscripts just collapse. And that's where the Ukrainians are trying to find somewhere where they can put enough pressure that might catalyze a collapse. Those are the two things we're really looking out for. Without those, it's difficult to see a major breakthrough coming from certainly the current state of this, the current tactical battle.
One of those effects we think from the home front that has been discussed recently is pressure as well from Russian defense to start a new round of mobilization. But with local elections coming up in Russia, it's reported that Putin might be hesitant to do that until after then. Does that give Ukraine something of a window to try and have a breakthrough now while Russia is short on troops?
Yes, it does, Louis. This is the conundrum. There's a certain amount of time element. We all know about the onset of winter where the conditions become bad for maneuver. There's a whole issue about logistics. This is all at the tactical level. It's a question of whether even if you had that time, you could do anything with it. But again, there's no doubt about it. The effects of this war, which of course Putin and his cronies thought was going to be over, within weeks, frankly, of the special military operation being announced, is really beginning to bite now. Inflation is rampant. The cost of living is beginning to rise. Russian resources are beginning to collapse, and of course, the early mobilization was largely taking people from east of the Urals, out of the jails, the poor, the criminal classes. I'm not disparaging the professional core element of the Russian army, but if you now go for a further mobilization, which of course from a military point of view makes every sense in the world if you want to win this, you begin to find that you are tackling all sorts of middle class people, all sorts of people who don't support the war. The Russians, I think, take a figure, have lost at least 500 to 700,000 youngsters who've just left the country, men and women, of course. So a mobilization would make sense in a total war, but you've got to convince the society that it's worth that sacrifice. And at a certain stage, enough people are going to say, I don't think the collapse of the Russian economy and the conscription of all these young men and women is worth it for Ukraine. So both sides are up against the sort of timetables, one a short-term one on the battlefield, looking for a breakthrough. The other one is a longer-term one of the capacity, certainly of the Russians, to continue to make the case that this is a national cause that's worth breaking the Russian economy, destroying its reputation, calling up all its young manpower to feed it into this fight. Thank you, Lee.